When you talk about human nature, really what you're asking is, what are those common traits that all individuals have in common? And by the way, this is something that the founding fathers of liberalism paid enormous attention to, right? And I believe that if you're going to think about liberalism and nationalism, you have to wrestle with these questions. And there are two big questions. The first question is, are men and women social beings above all else, or does it make more sense to emphasize their individuality? In other words, are humans fundamentally social animals who strive hard to carve out room for their individuality, or are they individuals who form social contracts? That's question number one. Question number two, have our critical faculties developed to the point where we can reach universal consensus on what defines the good life? Can we agree on first principles? Can we use reason? Are we able to reason our way through collectively and come to meaningful agreement on the big questions about life? The liberal take on human nature is that humans are basically atomistic individuals, the basic story. They operate as individuals in the state of nature. You know the basic story that Hobbes, who's not a liberal but laid out many of the founding principles of liberalism, makes, and that John Locke makes, that individuals are atomistic in the state of nature, and they come together and they form a social contract so that the individual comes before the social. And then, of course, liberals believe that it's impossible to come close to reaching a universal consensus on questions about the good life, right? But the point that I'm making to you here is, when you look at the two bedrock assumptions about individuality and about the ability of people to use their critical faculties to answer the big questions of life, and you look at the liberal perspective and you put those two assumptions together, you get significant potential for conflict. And then the question becomes, how do you prevent conflict? How do you set up a liberal society so as to avoid conflict? It's important to emphasize that when liberalism got its start, it was in large part concerned with the consequences of the Reformation, which was that Catholics and Protestants fought bloody wars in countries all over Europe. And again, the limits of reason show you that you can't answer which religion is superior, but at the same time, there's no question that people are profoundly attached to Catholicism and hate Protestantism, and vice versa. So how do you deal with that problem? This, again, is the problem that liberalism faces. When you talk about the liberal solution to the problem of conflict, there are sort of three elements that come together to, in effect, dampen conflict. The first is the concept of inalienable rights. What this says is that every individual on the planet has a set of rights. It could be life, liberty, and property, so forth and so on. But every individual on the planet has a set of rights that are inalienable, that nobody can take away from that person. And inalienable rights are of enormous importance for solving this problem. Because, for example, if somebody has the right to life, that means you can't kill that person. Somebody has liberty, life, liberty, pursuit of property, all these rights. Everybody has those rights, and you're not supposed to interfere with them. And the second is the norm of tolerance. And tolerance, in large part, grows out of this emphasis on rights, because if everybody has rights, and rights to think their own way, right, you in effect should be tolerant. So liberal societies place a very high premium on tolerance. right, in addition to rights. And again, the tolerance is inextricably linked with the rights. Once you have inalienable rights, there's going to be a big emphasis on tolerance. But the problem is, because of the vehemence of the disputes and the fact that there is a tendency for people, when they really disagree, to want to kill each other, tolerance is not going to be enough. And therefore, you need a state to act as a night watchman. Right? Liberals believe that you need a state. It's very clear that liberals have a mixed set of feelings about the state, in large part because a powerful state can threaten the individual's rights. But at the same time, virtually all liberals understand that you need a state, and you need a state to act as a night watchman. Because again, just to go back to square one, you have individuals out there who have profound differences about terribly important issues. And the question is, how do you prevent people from killing each other? And again, you emphasize rights, you emphasize tolerance, but those two things together are not enough. You need a state as well. Now, why is this the case? It really all began, at least in the United States, in the late 1800s, and it's a function of three things. One is the Industrial Revolution, two is nationalism, and three is these huge wars that we fight. Just on the Industrial Revolution, what happened when the United States really was hit hard with the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th, early 20th century is you had these huge industrial enterprises that came online that did certain things that had huge consequences for people all over the United States, and indeed for people all over the planet. And it became very obvious to politicians at the time. And the reason was that you had to manage this economy. You had to manage these huge industries and figure out rules and regulations. You had all sorts of labor unions, labor problems, child labor problems, and so forth and so on, that had to be managed by the state. There's no way you could avoid that. And then, of course, when you start fighting wars, whether it's the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, the state gets involved not only in running those wars, but when the wars are over with, you have to do all sorts of social engineering to reward the people who fought the wars. You remember the GI Bill? The GI Bill is a perfect example of a positive right. It's social engineering. So I started thinking about the relationship between realism and nationalism, and of course nationalism and liberalism. And what I wanted to do was figure out, in a theoretical way, just sort of how all of these isms fit together. Nationalism is, in my opinion, the most powerful political ideology on the planet. It's no accident that the world is populated by really nothing but nation states, and nation states embody nationalism. The focus on the individual and his or her inalienable rights turns liberalism into a universalistic or universalist ideology. In other words, there's this dimension in liberalism that grows out of its emphasis on the individual that makes it universal. What liberalism is saying is that every person on the planet has the same rights. Those rights are universal. They apply to everybody. If you focus on social groups, if you believe that human beings are social animals first and foremost, you end up with a particularist ideology like nationalism. So nationalism doesn't focus on individuals, it focuses on the group. And there is your group, and then there is the other. Liberalism focuses on the individual, and once you focus on the individual, you quickly end up with a universalist ideology when you throw in inalienable rights. And of course, when you start thinking about liberal hegemony, just to get ahead of myself, when the rights of people outside the borders of the United States are violated, there's a very powerful temptation to go abroad. Liberal hegemony is doomed as a foreign policy because nationalism and realism are more powerful forces, and they undermine liberal hegemony at every turn. All you want is a state as a night watchman. Modus vivendi liberals, negative rights over positive rights. Modus vivendi, or classical liberals, really dislike positive rights. They loathe social engineering. They make the argument, almost all of them, that not only is it not desirable, but we're not good at it, and that's why we shouldn't do it. You know all the arguments. Republicans make these arguments all the time, that we should let the market decide how to solve problem X or solve problem Y, because markets are much more efficient than the state. When the state gets involved doing anything, it bollockses it up. That's the classical liberal, the modus vivendi liberal view. Progressive liberals, on the other hand, they believe in negative rights because everybody believes you need the night watchman to protect those liberties. But progressive liberals also believe that it's very important for the state to get involved, to do social engineering, to create a level playing field. The first big difference is between negative and positive rights and the desirability and efficacy of social engineering. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly is he talking about? When we talk about negative rights, we're talking about, liberty. We're talking about freedom from state interference. We're talking about free speech, freedom of assembly, the right to property, right? This is where you have a state that just protects your freedoms, right? Positive rights are where the state actually interferes to guarantee that you enjoy rights that are inalienable. And I think the best example of this, and I'll talk more about it as we go along, is the right to equal opportunity. And equal opportunity is where the state comes in and it levels the playing field. It's not equal outcomes, it's equal opportunity, right? And needless to say, if you believe in positive rights, you're going to believe in the desirability of social engineering. Because there's no way you can put positive rights into effect without doing a lot of social engineering. Once you accept the fact that progressive liberalism has triumphed and that we live in a world where liberals are committed to social engineering, this liberal state called the United States is heavily into social engineering. But if you're into social engineering at home, it doesn't take long before you think you can do social engineering abroad. I remember the Iraq War, which I adamantly and publicly opposed before it happened. And I would say to people, do you seriously believe that you're going to go into Iraq and do social engineering in a country that you really don't understand? We can't even do social engineering at home, much less in a foreign country. Liberal hegemony is basically the foreign policy that the United States has pursued since the Cold War ended. Almost everybody I know agrees on this. Some people use a different label for it, but I think liberal hegemony is a fair label, and it's one that many people use. It's very important to understand that the foreign policy establishment, or what Ben Rhodes, you remember Ben Rhodes, he worked for Barack Obama, he called the foreign policy establishment the blob. The blob loves liberal hegemony, right? It's the approved solution for how to conduct American foreign policy. But at the same time, there's a small group of foreign policy experts who think it's a deeply flawed strategy. And I'm one of those people. Regarding the pursuit of liberal hegemony, just for background purposes here, between 1990 and 2000, you can argue that we did pretty well with liberal hegemony. I would argue against that, but you can make a pretty good case that that was the heyday of liberal hegemony. And since 2000, and certainly since 2001, everything has gone south. And the $64,000 question that's on the table today is what went wrong? So here's the modern liberal template. Core assumptions: individualism, no universal agreement on first principles. Second, progressive liberalism has triumphed. And with progressive liberalism, you get negative and positive inalienable rights. Those are inalienable rights, those positive rights as well as those negative rights. You get tolerance, and you get a state that engages in social engineering. That's the basic liberal story.